Welcome to The Lubber's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. You're with Mike
and Ian
as we continue our rereading of the Aubrey Maturin novels of Patrick O'Brien. It's great to be back for our 6th episode in our rereading of the Mauritius Command. Ian, what were we up to last time, and what do we have to look forward to this week?
Well, Mike, last time it began with disappointment and gloom as Stephen and Jack were ashore at the Cape of Good Hope. Stephen preparing to spend the British King's money on mercenaries and propaganda. Jack clashing heads with the soldiers who turned out to be much less active and daring than our friend Colonel Keating. We got into the world of Patrick O'Brien obscurantism. We talked about folk customs from rural England. We talked about the ghost in the bread room and its effects on Killick. And meanwhile, all creatures, great and small, including lots of seabirds, were at risk from stormy weather. In fact, a hurricane, no less. And Mike, this week, we are post-hurricane. We are putting the ships and the fleet back together after the hurricane. We've got administrative stress coming from that. We've got human frailty. We've got the grinding reality of dockyard corruption and what is called Cap-a-Bar at the Cape. We've got poignant comedy from rain-soaked letters, not to mention an unborn porcupine. We're going to test out the chasm lying between Jack's pragmatic Toryist position on the value of a human life and Lord Clonfert's performative liberalism. Not the only time we're going to say performative in this week's chapter, I've got to say. Finally, as we get to the invasion of La Réunion, we see the Gothic brutality of war subverted by the quiet, but deadly in its own way, intelligence work of Stephen Maturin. And Mike, this is all going to show that sometimes a well-placed word is mightier than a broadside.
Ooh, I love that. Certainly something we're all familiar with in our political world nowadays.
I can't think of what you could be talking about.
That's right. Well, Ian, as we dive into the opening of chapter 6, we find our heroes in a rather dismal spot. As you said, we just left them surviving this massive hurricane, and now Jack Aubrey has managed to limp his battered squadron back to the Cape of Good Hope to refit. So they went off with that big victory dinners last time. Yep. We had all the success then with the massive hurricane. And what do you think?
Well, it's been a tough time, at least from the physical fabric of the fleet. Oh, get all the F's there. Physical fabric of the fleet. You would think that bringing 5 dismasted, leaking ships back to port would earn a hero's welcome for Jack Aubrey, but Patrick O'Brien loves to undercut that kind of expectation. We get straight into the grinding reality, the unglamorous reality of naval command. No banquets for Jack. He's got dockyards supplied by small-minded men with small store cupboards and small views of the world and unparalleled rapacity. And Mike, this theme of dockyard corruption, which ends up getting called Cap-a-Bar, interestingly, that's a bit of a theme, and Jack dwells on it at some length, right?
And he does. It's funny, Ian, as soon as you said that in the introduction, and I hadn't thought about it until then, but I went, wait, capybara, this large South American rodent.
Oh.
You know, we're like letters apart. So, okay, there you go, listeners. Tell us, where in the world did this connection come from? I have no idea here.
There'll be a prize of a bottle with the yellow seal. For
the yellow seal, exactly.
Etymological connection between Cap-a-Bar, meaning corruption of stores, and capybara being the rodent from South America.
All right, so sorry.
The challenge has been set, Mike.
Completely derailed us here. It's funny. So who knows? Anyway, so naval corruption, it's a massive headache for historical commanders. We've heard about it before. Yeah. And this time it's particularly egregious because these officials at the yard know that Jack's squadron took valuable prizes at St. Paul's, and they're determined to bleed Jack dry without any regard to the fact that they're not going to get paid for any of this stuff for months and months and months. So Jack's having to borrow gold at usurious rates just to get his basic supplies. And but of course, I'm sure his superiors understand.
Well, guess what? It turns out not. He's getting no top cover from the boss. Admiral Bertie shrugs it off and says, basically, it's a cost of doing business. He says, these dockyard people are not plaster saints, nor yet choir boys. He says, basically, Jack, I don't care how you manage it, as long as the ships are ready for sea in less than 2 weeks. And in some ways, Mike, this is going back to the world of Jack getting the Sophie ready for sea right at the beginning of Master and Commander, except that was just one matter of one little brig and getting one main topmast yard or whatever it was, main yard. This time it's him and entire squadron, and these are bigger ships, and it's a much more serious deal. And the clock is ticking here. Bertie needs him ready for sea in 2 weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks. And the corruption isn't just on shore. Jack's found that it has invaded his own ship here. He discovers that his bosun, Mr. Fellows, has been engaged in capybar, right? This corruption too. The traditional naval slang for the illicit disposal or theft of His Majesty's property, which was widespread and an almost accepted practice if the goods were damaged. Okay, if they're damaged and it's within your purview, bosun, carpenter, whatever. But Jack's telling us Mr. Fellows has gone way over the line.
He really does. And I'm with Jack here. This guy is really, he's taking it on a little bit here. We know that there was lightning damage to the anchor, to the best bower. Well, do you know what? Fellows sold not only the lightning damaged anchor, but also the kedge, the backup anchor, and 50 fathoms of rope, writing that all off as one big loss here. This makes Jack furious. And he thinks, well, I should really break Fellows at court-martial. This guy deserves to pay the price. We'll come back to the idea of court-martials later on in this chapter.
Right.
But he's also a skilled bosun in a distant station, and there are not many of those guys around. So O'Brien shows us the pragmatic reality of Jack. He needs a first-rate bosun. He has to swallow his rage for the good of the service, because if you'll pardon the pun, good bosuns don't grow on trees down at the Cape of Good Hope.
Right. And I guess it just goes to show us that both capybara and capybaras can be taken too far.
Indeed. It's a
well-known
fact.
No, sorry. I'm sorry. I will not mention it again. Well, in the midst of all this heavy administrative stress here, O'Brien, I think, drops in some of the best comic writing, but I could say this every book here. A mail ship arrives, but it's been soaked through by tropical rainstorms, and the letters there are this moldy, coalesced mess here.
And the scene is comedy gold. They've got this pulpy mess of all these letters from Sophie. She's never learned to send duplicates. She's never learned to number them so he can follow the orders. Meanwhile, in the midst of all this chaos, Jack says, well, there you are, Stephen. This is as Stephen walks into the cabin. Well, there you are. How happy I am to see you. What have you there? An unborn porcupine. Complete non sequitur, to which Jack says, well, there's glory for you.
Right.
Which, by the way, I think is a quote from Lewis Carroll. I've got an idea that might have come from Lewis Carroll or somewhere. But anyhow, it's knockabout stuff.
It is. You're absolutely right, Ian. Lewis Carroll did use that. It's been used by other people as well, but it was what Humpty Dumpty said to Alice after having Alice do the math for him. It was he said a cravat that she had called out was a happy unbirthday present for him. And Alice had told him that she quite liked birthday presents, not unbirthday presents. He said, well, you've got it wrong. How many days are your unbirthday? And she does the math, and they realize that there are 364 days when you get unbirthday presents. And Humpty Dumpty replies, "There's glory for you." One of my favorite childhood books too. Well, I was a little older than childhood. I just love that book. So anyway, so Ian, you're going to have to help us here, because Jack asked Stephen, once we've gotten past the porcupine, to, please give me a hand with these letters. And, O'Brien describes it. They're kind of sitting there like scholars using a magnifying glass, and crocus of antimony and diluted copperas to read the letters. And I'm sure most of our readers went, of course, that's exactly what I'd use. I went, what the heck is that? And Ian was glad to help out.
With pleasure. Now, this is the kind of thing that we should all have. That cupboard underneath the sink where you have all the really toxic, really kind of radioactive detergents and cleaning. So this is what you need. You need some crocus of antimony because this stuff is a brownish yellow oxidized derivative of antimony. Now, some of you might have heard of Stephen Maturin and other doctors using an everlasting antimony pill. You give the patient this antimony to take as a pill, and they either vomit it out or they do the other thing with it, and it's kind of a purgative. Well, similarly, crocus of antimony, which is an oxide, was as a substance that you could give, for example, in a wine to make into an emetic or a purgative wine. One of the interesting or problematic things about 18th century chemistry is that the terminology was all based on the physical appearance of the substance, not its composition, not its structure, not its function. So crocus means anything that has a reddish hue, named after the early blooming flower that is traditionally red. These days you get all kinds of colors of crocuses. But, for example, there was a substance called crocus of Mars, which was ferric oxide, named after the red planet because ferric oxide is red and Mars is red. Now, this crocus of antimony could have been used somehow, maybe, to recover washed out ink. We know that antimony chloride was used by forgers to erase traditional iron gall ink, and we'll come to iron gall inks again in a second. But this is already starting me to think, Mike, that this is Stephen Maturin's, not only his medicine cabinet, but also maybe his printing document forging cabinet springing open here to do double duty. So we've got crocus of antimony. Do you want to take the next one? This copperas. What do we know about that?
Copper is perhaps a little easier to pin down. Ferrous sulfate, or a green vitriol in the 18th century terminology, and it can be used to re-blacken ink. So this would make perfect sense here, right? The iron gall ink works by reacting ferrous sulfate with the tannic acids to create a black complex. And that tannic acid is often from oak galls, some, in the paper itself there. And as the ink ages, the iron can oxidize, turning it into iron oxide rust, or wash away, leaving behind faint brown or brownish gray text. We're looking at a lot of these old documents as people are sharing on the Facebook groups and everything else. And we see this, brownish gray text here. Well, adding a fresh solution of copperas dissolved in water provides the new iron ions that react with the remaining tannins in the faded ink, instantly darkening it to a deep blue-black. So there you are. For those of you who are, moving and unpacking and looking at your old college notes, this is, copperas is your friend.
Or even want to amend your college transcript. Why not? Just
then the antimony might be the thing, right?
Hold on to the idea that Stephen's first comic turn was to make a joke, not make a joke, to point out that he's carrying what was it, an unborn porcupine?
Fetus, right.
There's a very tenuous theme emerging here because they're sitting there piecing together these letters, and we're learning these very fragmented domestic details. The old nonpareil apple tree is bearing fruit. The strawberries have failed. The new parlor chimney is drawing well. There's this really touching moment when Jack realizes that the twins now have hair, and the little wisps of stuff that he'd blown away earlier, thinking they were just shakings, that was actually a lock of his kid's hair. So bless him, he creeps around the cabin floor, finds the wisp of hair, tucks it into his pocketbook. And Mike, here comes the next whammy, because Jack's reading ahead, and we get one particular remark from Sophie that they're both puzzled by.
Yeah. Let me pause and rewind for just a second, Ian, because I want to help the listeners the way you helped me earlier. Okay. Shakings, unraveled rope. I kept, I said to Ian, yes. What is shaking? That's unraveled rope. So it really helps to have a sailor in the crew. Yeah. So, well, Jack is worried because he can't make out stuff, but he does see one thing that's pretty clear, that Sophie says she is surprisingly well and has underlined it twice. And he's wondering, well, wait a minute, why surprisingly well? Why underline twice? Has she been ill? Could she been ill? I don't know. What do you think? Any reason you could think of? Sophie could have been ill, but is surprisingly well.
I'm torn between what might be a spoiler for a later chapter.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
And calling out that there was a bit of a plant in chapter 1 with Jack spending a night ashore, and maybe we got the beginnings of a payoff here. Except, you know what? Stephen Maturin doesn't smoke it.
No.
Stephen Maturin, who would normally have gone, yeah, of course I know what's happening here. So either he's being sort of deliberately waving it off, or he's just, his mind is elsewhere. And I suspect the latter, because a few lines later on in this scene, Stephen confesses that he's feeling low. He's feeling mighty low. And he suggests they play his lament for Tir Nanog. And this is a very touching thing, especially for a person of Irish extraction. And also, Stephen's mentioned this in the past, right?
It post-captain, right? Yeah. They said, what is that? It's, Stephen had said, the only bearable part of my country. It vanished long ago. In pre-Christian mythology, this is a paradise, or the land of eternal youth. And I think you and I were both wondering, why is Stephen feeling low? Maybe it's something that O'Brien has left out that we kept screaming about.
Right. Maybe, where is Diana in all of this?
Right. For crying out loud.
And O'Brien takes us back later on in this chapter to ascribing Stephen's mood to his kind of frustration at not being able to make moves against Bonaparte. But you've got to say, like, this guy had the love of his life, and that whole relationship, as we see it now, is gone, has failed, is broken. And right. Jack, bless him, rubs salt into the presumed wound here by going on his little tear-off about marriage. He says, I think old Jarvie, he means Earl St. Vincent, the first Lord of the Admiralty, I think old Jarvie was altogether wrong in saying that a sea officer had no business to marry. Yet, I can see what he meant. I should not be unmarried for the world, No, not for a flag. But you cannot conceive how my mind has been going back to Ashgrove Cottage these days, when I should be thinking about getting the squadron to sea. And there's two kinds of here, I think, Mike. There's the for Jack Aubrey, who's worrying about his bride, who's connected back to the life he's left behind with Sophie back home. He's human, and he's beloved, and he's loving. On the other hand, Mike, there's an for Stephen too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking this could just be one of those things that, just came out of O'Brien's mind, whether it was unconscious or conscious, but it certainly, I think it struck both of us that way. Well, and we keep Jack right in the domestic world here, except instead of this touching domestic scene back home, because Jack's first lieutenant is busy repairing and dealing with the dockyards and doing all that, Jack has to deal with the domestic crises of his crew. And he's now talking about Mr. Collins, an 18-year-old senior master's mate who comes to Jack in a panic because a local girl claims that due to Mr. Collins' attentions, all her girdles are now too tight.
And we get a classic bit of Jack Aubrey advice here. He says to the boy, well, it might only be indigestion, a pound or two of beefsteak pudding. Wait until we come in from the next cruise. And I love two things I love about this. First of all, Jack is all worldly wisdom when it comes to the reproductive lives of his midshipmen, perhaps not so much in his own home turf, in his own marriage. Plus, Jack, as we're going to learn later in the canon, has got form when it comes to this particular activity at the Cape. But never mind. He does drop this nice literary and biblical allusion. He warns Midshipman Collins that if he should marry every girl he plays love tokens with, then the place would soon look like Abraham's bosom. So, Mike, help us out here with Abraham's bosom. What's that?
Well, this is absolutely an Aubreyism of sorts. It's not the, I think, more or an Aubrey misuse of a term. Yeah. So it's a reference from the Gospel of Luke, traditionally denoting a place of comfort for the righteous dead. But Jack delightfully mangles the theology, using it to describe sort of a massive, crowded, patriarchal harem. So he gets the reference just slightly but comically wrong. And I have to say, on part of Luke, as much as heartwarming and domestic as we've been, If Luke was talking to us now, he'd be saying, let's think about the girls, not just the midshipmen. Yeah.
Quite right, too. Thank you, Luke.
Yes.
So we're not done with the little comedic bits in this scene either, because next comes Matthew Bolton, forecastleman, marching into the cabin with three mute, severely shaved and scraped companions, all turned out really spick and span here. And there's a little callback for continuity here. Bolton reminds Jack, and reminds us as well, that Jack had pulled Bolton out of the sea back when they were on the Polycrest back in Post Captain. And Jack, therefore, is now presumed to be responsible for fixing all of the problems that beset Matthew Bolton, forecastleman. And it turns out that Bolton had been the victim of some sharp practice by a prize agent regarding money from Buenos Aires and Montevideo, which I presume, Mike, is a reference again to the raid on Buenos Aires that Sir Home Popham had led a year or two prior to this in the real world timeline.
Exactly.
But the first lieutenant should have been his first port of call for getting this kind of practical help. But Bolton had insisted on claiming his right to the Commodore's help because of this prior episode with being fished out of the sea by Aubrey. So Jack, bless him, does exactly what he's asked for. He sits down, he's under the intense, staring eyes of these four sailors and writes this terrifying legal admonition to the agent. He reads it back to them, and O'Brien notes that Jack uses what he calls his all hands to punishment voice, and this gives the men the utmost satisfaction. So it's a really nice Aubrey moment here. He's absolutely 100% solid and there for his crew. How well connected he is to what's going on at home. The intention is there, Mike, but I don't think we can give him 10 out of 10.
No. But it's I love how O'Brien transitions us from this high stakes survival of a hurricane to the exhausting realities of dockyard extortion, to the comedy of the ruined mail, to the domestic thoughts of Jack, to his domestic thoughts, not only back home, but on the ship there. And it shows exactly why Jack's men love him and why command is such a heavy, encompassing burden for him, because I think he feels the same way. And that attachment, I think it would be hard for me thinking in Jack's mind, how do you extend that across the whole fleet? You can't. You can't. Right. This is, Jack grew up as a boy here in this family. This is as much domestic as ours was. This is, it's a bit of a burden, and Jack, really doing amazingly well.
Wow. While Jack is taking care of the ones right next to him and buried himself in paperwork and in the squadron refit, Patrick O'Brien gives us a moment on shore in a very different setting. In fact, in a setting that we almost began the novel with. Stephen Maturin and Dr. McAdam, the surgeon working with Lord Clonfert, formerly of the Otter, now of the Nereid. Just as we saw when we first met him, McAdam is once again half drunk, but his psychological insight is on point. He perfectly diagnoses the root of the tension between Jack and Clonfert.
Yeah, he really does. McAdam tells Stephen that Clonfert's behavior is entirely driven by emulation. Yeah. He says that if Jack is a dashing frigate captain, Clonfert is determined to be, in O'Brien's word, dashing frigate captain to the power of 10, whether or no, kind of clarifying that, Clonfert will, again, in O'Brien's words, outdo the Commodore, though he burst. So it's pretty extreme here.
Right. And we're going to come back to this theme many times in many more chapters, right the way to the end of this story. Just how much damage is Clonfert going to inflict on himself to try and perform his way out of the shadow of Jack Aubrey. Now, this frames the kind of dynamics that we're going to see in the very next scene as Jack calls all the captains aboard for a war council. He mainly wants to know, how close are you all to being ready for sea? And we've already seen before that this is the kind of question that Clonfert is competitive about. He likes to say, ready for sea at a moment's notice. But Captain Pym of the Sirius says, I'm having trouble with the water tanks. Clonfert says Nereid will be ready in 36 hours, smiling kind of meaningfully at Captain Pym to say, I did you over. But Captain Lucius Curtis of the Magicienne chimes in and says, I can sail this minute if I can have leave to pick up my water at Flat Island. And instantly, Clonfert has been done over by Curtis. His smile turns to a look of surprised vexation. And once again, just as McAdam has been saying to Stephen, Clonfert is seeking external validation. He's trying to play up, to play a role, and he's really emotionally fragile about it. It's really devastating for him when somebody, even with good intention, happens to be upstaging him.
Yeah, yeah. And while this is going on too, before the squadron can actually sail, I think in this territory, because it's so remote from everything else belonging to Mother England, they don't typically have enough captains together for, to convene a court-martial. And they've had Captain Woolcombe, who lost the laurel to the French, who's been waiting and worrying, what's going to happen here, as well as while everybody's been on shore with all this stuff going on and all the waiting, O'Brien's been telling us that a lot of people have been they could have been up to a lot better things that all this time, idle hands in the devil's workshop and all that. Boy, there's a lot of charges that have been brought, a lot of things that have to be sorted out, and the Admiral wants them all dealt with now while we have everybody here. So in Woolcombe's case, everybody knows that Woolcombe fought bravely, that the French ship was vastly superior. So an honorable acquitted is guaranteed. And we visited this before. We'll revisit it again in the future. O'Brien tells us that everybody knows this except poor Woolcombe himself, who sits through the trial in an agony of anxiety.
So, Mike, it's a sobering reminder for all the captains present that even though they might believe in one part of their brain that it's a formality and everybody knows that the guy's going to be honorably acquitted, they're all thinking, that could be me. And knowing that these captains are going to sit in judgment on Woolcombe reminds them that these court-martials are basically amateur lawyers sitting in judgment where their decision has no route of appeal. So it's a real moment of career jeopardy for Woolcombe that many could be exposed to. And we know that Jack already has been as well. In fact, I got a bit of an echo of Master and Commander. The text here says, when Jack handed back the captain's sword, he's talking now about Woolcombe having been acquitted, when Jack handed back the captain's sword with an elegant, if somewhat studied, formal speech. And there was exactly that kind of speech given by the president of the court-martial to Jack Aubrey when he was acquitted for losing the Sophie at the end of Master and Commander.
Yeah.
So the weight of naval law is really pressing on these officers. And it's also not a happy scene where all of the cases that come into the court are surfaced and discussed. All the kind of dirty linen being washed. The captains have to deal with this very unprepossessing picture of the Navy. And one particular moment that I think pricks all of their consciences, the text says, one master charged his captain with keeping false muster on the grounds that he had a friend's son on the ship's books, when in fact the young gentleman was at school in England, perfectly normal practice, but one which would have wrecked the captain's career if the court had not performed some singular acrobatics to save him. So we know that Jack and a whole bunch of other captains, Henage Dundas and all Jack's mates, have all done that, and they must all be sitting there thinking, there but for the grace of God.
Right. It's so funny. After all this, we've kind of gone through Admiral Bertie's corruption earlier in this book, and there's the corruption of the Capybar, there's the corruption of the shipyards, and here are the captains all upset with that sort of stuff. But here's their own little version of corruption. But that's my corruption. And it's, it's always the speck in your eye and the log in my own eye. But that's where we are. And speaking of philosophical kind of debates about that, I think it's kind of a neat that there's a dinner following the trial, which has a really nice philosophical debate, as well as a little bit more illumination of the characters that we're dealing with here in this book. So there's this massive saddle of mutton. Stephen asks Jack, in casual conversation with all the captains of his squadron here, if passing a sentence of death ruins his appetite, because they're talking about what might have happened here. And Jack pragmatically says, no, if a man's committed a straightforward case of cowardice, he must be hanged for the good of the service. And Captain Pym jumps in to defend this hard discipline, saying that Stephen would have to agree that, right, if a medical man would, as he says, cut off a gangrene limb to save the rest of the body, that there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Well, Stephen demolishes him. And this is one of those subjects, a little bit like slavery, where when you get Stephen Maturin on the topic, he's going to give you the full force of his philosophical thinking here. He points out that, first of all, a surgeon doesn't amputate in a spirit of revenge or making an ignominious show of it. It's not about humiliating the limb. He says this analogy would liken a surgeon to a common hangman, and everybody knows that calling somebody a hangman, this is a rebuke. It's a bad character connection. And meanwhile, Eliot tries to weigh in on the side of pragmatism and the death penalty here. He quotes a judge who had said to a man sentenced to hang for horse theft, "You, sir, are not to be hanged for stealing a horse from a common, but that others may not steal horses from commons." And this is the idea of deterrence as a reason for capital punishment, which Stephen makes short work of. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I love this, kind of this deterrence theory here, which makes a lot of sense. Like 18th century jurists like Justice Bueller, they talked about deterrence a lot, but Stephen dismisses this entirely. And O'Brien writes, "And do you not find," asks Stephen, "that in fact horses are not daily stolen from commons? You do not. Nor do I believe that you will make captains braver or wiser by hanging or shooting them for cowardice or erroneous judgment. It should join the ordeal of the plowshare, floating or pricking to prove witchcraft, and judicial combat among the relics of a Gothic past." Boom. Mic drop. Stephen Maturin.
Absolutely. Well, Jack spots the difficult political ground that they've dwelt upon here. We'll come back to an aspect of Stephen's argument in a minute, because it's kind of interesting. There is a naval connection to the point that Stephen's making here.
Right.
But Jack is worried, and he throws out a few names. He says, if we don't get off this subject, we're gonna end up talking about Keppel and Byng. So Admiral Keppel was a guy who in the 18th century was court-martialed but acquitted for poor leadership at the Battle of Ushant. And Admiral Byng, John Byng, famously court-martialed and shot for cowardice after failing to defend Minorca to the utmost earlier on in the 18th century. And the case of Admiral Byng was actually what Voltaire, the French philosopher, was referring to when he gave his famous quote saying, the British like to shoot an admiral from time to time in order to encourage the others. And Voltaire is mocking the idea of deterrence, and Stephen is absolutely borrowing Voltaire's argument here. And that lines up completely with Stephen's free-thinking Enlightenment philosophy, I think.
Yeah. And Jack mentions a few other cases back from English naval history as well.
Right. He talks about Gambier, he talks about Hervey, and he talks about Basque Roads. And this is a much more contemporary reference as they're sitting there in the cabin, because this is all about a fire ship attack on a French squadron at anchor in this place called the Basque Roads on the west coast of France. Gambier had been called out for accused of being timid in not backing up this planned fire ship attack. This all had happened in the real world barely a year before what's happening in this chapter here. And of course, Aubrey and Cochrane can't exist in the same room, as we know. So the name that's missed out from this whole situation here is Cochrane's name. It was Cochrane who dreamed up the fire ship attack. Cochrane was the cheerleader for the case against Gambier, which in turn led to some of the ill will that you might say contributed to Cochrane having his big downfall over the stock exchange fraud in 1814, which is going to form part of Jack Aubrey's story in a few books' time. So a very, very long-term plant there for Jack Aubrey and his Cochrane connection.
Yeah. And so we've had this, fall over from the courts martial. We've had this discussion going on here. And now I said, we'll, get into some more depth of character analysis. Lord Clonfert leaps into the conversation. He loudly agrees with Stephen, declaring that a capital execution is, in his words, a revolting spectacle, and passionately argues for the value of human life, saying there is nothing so precious. Juan, we'll talk about this more in a minute, but let us just say that this is indeed a very long and deep plant for Clonfert.
Right.
Yes.
Clonfert has the worldview that human life is precious. We'll test that idea and its consistency later on. Jack pushes back, and we see this strong contrast between Jack's worldview and Clonfert's. Jack says, we might overestimate the value of a human life in theory. And he points out that ships are meant to bring as many people blown to kingdom come as possible. And we're in a service where we are here to defend by force and to fight, and that means to kill. One man, says Jack, is not to be balanced against the good of the service. And this was probably Jack's first attempt to bring the situation sort of under control. Clonfert, who's got the bit between his own teeth here, gets very heated. He says he disagrees entirely. He brings a political point forward. He says the Tory view of a human life, blah, blah, blah. And he's about basically to critique the Tory view of human life because Jack, his Commodore, is a dyed-in-the-wool Tory, the old-fashioned paternalist agrarian, this is how society is type of worldview. Clonfert is talking and thinking more like a liberal, or in 18th century terms, more like a radical here. And Jack immediately exercises his authority as Commodore to shut down the political talk, and I think also to save Clonfert from himself, because getting into a political, personal one-to-one argument with your commanding officer is probably not a smart move.
It's amazing to me, Ian, that we've kind of done a real quick summary of this, but throughout this conversation, Jack has tried to ratchet down the tension, tried to, kind of almost keep Clonfert from embarrassing himself. He's sort of saying early on, gentlemen, let's not go too deeply. Let's not get into politics. When Clonfert says, I disagree entirely, this to his commanding officer. Yeah. Jack says, well, let us hope, Lord Clonfert, this is the only matter we ever disagree upon. And, tries to lighten it up. And then, Jack's already, a while back talked about politics. And now he's like, well, this is your Tory way of, view of human life. And I was like, whoa. And so for Jack to, use this deflection tactic, I think was awfully kind, because Clonfert could have found himself brought up in the next convening of a court martial right here, I suspect. Right. But using that strong voice to say, Lord Clonfert, the bottle stands by you, and then taking that pause to shift the conversation to a little bit of a body story, again, about, we've been talking about the human value of human life. Let me tell you how much the number of human lives on this island seem to have been increasing since we got here. I've got 2 midshipmen, who may have gotten 2 local girls pregnant. And, it relieves the tension, but this philosophical divide between Jack and Clonfert. And I think even over and above the philosophical divide, this one-upsmanship, this, constantly, Clonfert, for crying out loud. And Jack saying, let's not do this. But Ian, tell us a little bit about where Jack took this and maybe why this is, maybe why this is important for Jack, or might have been on his mind.
Well, we've mentioned it already. Jack Aubrey's sexual history in Southern Africa is something that's going to come back. Liaisons with local girls and the getting of illegitimate children is something that's going to be a theme in a few books' time. But we also get this nice little reference here, a bit of an Easter egg, when he says that one of the midshipmen was said to have got a girl with child who was, as he calls it, Isabella colored. And this is a really interesting way to describe a color, because it has connotations of the coloring of horses, to my surprise, when I looked into it, which is one of O'Brien's preoccupations, right? O'Brien loves horses. And Isabella, or Isabelline, is a pale grey-yellow color, a fawn or a parchment color, a kind of dingy beige. And it's primarily used to describe the coloring of certain breeds of animals that in terms of their coats, especially horses, but also birds and other animals as well. And it was also a color shade used to refer to clothing. The color is a pale grayish yellow. It dates back to around 1600. It's often associated with a legend about the Archduchess Isabella of Spain. And the legend, probably apocryphal, nonetheless says that this Isabella vowed to wear the same undergarment throughout the long siege of Ostend, which was a siege being waged by her husband, King Albert VII. This campaign lasted from 1601 to 1604, so 3 years.
Whoa.
Unsurprisingly, this caused her chemise to turn a rather dingy colour. So this off-white hue, the colour of Isabella's drawers, was hence known as the colour of Isabella. Some sources also suggest that the term originated from a similar story about another Isabella, Isabella I of Castile at the siege of Granada. Or maybe that it's a corruption of Zibellino, which is a name meaning sable fur. Either way, it's an interesting little O'Brien thing for us to dig into. Now, this dinner has been navigating, crashing backwards and forwards between human life and philosophy, and then finally bawdy humor about midshipmen. Mike, where's it all going to end up?
Well, it's kind of nice because we had, in the midst of everything that was going on earlier, we had that one touching moment between, there you are, Stephen, and what have you, there's glory for you. I thought that was a touching moment. And now here's another one. It's after dinner. It's later that evening. Jack and Stephen are reflecting on the dinner, and Stephen apologizes. He said, I should not have set that hair running. Yeah. He tells him, that was a personal question. It was not meant to be a public question to you. But Stephen wonders, was that Jack Aubrey, my friend, I heard talking, or was that Jack Aubrey, the Commodore, I heard talking? And Jack says, well, I was a bit pompous and I spoke with unbending severity of a Commodore, but he confesses that some of that was him and that Clonfert's, what he called tragic airs and moralizing, really vexed him.
And Jack doesn't seem to be able to put it into words, but Stephen can, I think. He's sitting, writing in his diary, noting that there's this irony, this strange comparison between Jack Aubrey on the one hand, who's got so much to lose. He's got wealth, he's got happiness, he's got a family. His family is growing, as it turns out. He values his own life much less than Clonfert, whose immaterial possessions are pitifully small, whose whole life is a bit of a show and an exhibition, but values his life and other forms of human life extremely. So there's this sort of disconnect. And I think O'Brien is presenting this as Jack Aubrey's got a maturer view, at least a very old-fashioned, as he says, Tory view of we all have human lives and our lives are precious, but they fall within the context of a wider structure and a wider society, and we are just part of it. And, that means that our survival doesn't always trump the good of society or the good of the system, whereas Clonfert thinks the opposite. And finally, Mike, we get a little literary allusion from Stephen, one that I think we might have mentioned before, but tell us about this Milton quote here.
Yeah. So Stephen's writing down, nothing, as Milton observes, profits a man like proper self-esteem. Oh. So as Ian said, keen listeners might have noticed that in the last episode, we mentioned this Milton, but a bit prematurely. I think this runs together sometimes for us. It is a reference to, I don't think we explored where it came from, to John Milton's Paradise Lost, specifically Book 8, where the angel Raphael tells Adam, ofttimes nothing profits more than self-esteem grounded on just and right.
All right. It's a great quote for this moment, right? Because Clonfert does not have proper or well-founded self-esteem. His sense of worth is external, as we said last time. It's a little bit artificial, and he's trying desperately to outshine people like Aubrey. And O'Brien uses this dinner and this conversation not only to talk about death penalty, but to expose the psychology of Clonfert bit by bit, even more, setting the stage for decisions that Clonfert's going to make later in the book. Now, Mike, all of that, I think, takes us quite deep into the world of Clonfert. This sounds like a really great moment for us to step away and grab a quick break and hear one or two short messages, and then we will be right back. So welcome back. I hope you had a good break. We wanted to talk briefly about our Patreon channel. And as you all know, our Patreon channel is the way that you can get involved in supporting the show, but also in getting some deeper dives into some of the material. For example, we've been talking since the last episode about the druidical history lying behind obscure customs in English towns. One of our lines of investigation even uncovered an author on that subject called John Aubrey. So there is a John Aubrey historian lying at the bottom of all of this debate about druidical customs and black rams. Make of that what you will. But the only place you can get that is if you head over to patreon.com/Lubber's Hole and join one of our tiers and join the community of folks who are following and supporting the show. Right now, as we speak, sitting here in third week of March 2026, there's a very special opportunity for our Patreon supporters to get involved. Listen to the end of the show and we'll tell you some more about that. So, Mike, here we are getting back into the chapter again. We've been talking about Clonfert. Should we get back into him and his self-esteem?
Yeah, we just talked about that self-esteem, not grounded on what is just and right, but it's all about him and built on the external, the adulation of his crew, his desperate attempts to sort of outdo other people and, be the center of attention kind of thing. It makes me think, this is not in O'Brien here, but, I've heard recently about the kind of the classical definition of a hero. I think of a hero one way, that a hero is somebody with the strength for two, because the hero uses their strength for others.
Yeah, okay.
And I thought, wow, okay, here we go. And what does Clonfert use his for? And that's exactly where we kind of open back up again. We're seeing this need for glory, not for helping others, but for glory, play out almost immediately. The Boadicea has set sail. They've got Mr. Farquhar, the governor designate, aboard. They're making this rapid passage, doing up to 300 miles a day in the trade winds. They rendezvous exactly with the rest of the blockading squadron off Mauritius, and Captain Lambert comes aboard with news, including that Clonfert had been sent to cruise off the southeast of the island and took it upon himself to execute a daring cutting out mission and, spike the guns of a battery, captured a ship. Tell me more, Ian. What is this?
To pick up on your point before, this is like heroic, but in a kind of false, shallow sense. It's heroism for the sake of being performative on his own behalf, I think. It's not really heroism that serves the collective. It's not heroism that serves anybody else here. Jack instantly sees the strategic folly behind this mad scheme of Clonfert's. The ship that he captured was an American neutral. Jack calls it a damned unfortunate object for dashing at, and a damned odd moment to choose for dashing. And there's a little bit of a real-world history parallel here. Clonfert's opposite number in the real-world timeline is a guy called Nesbitt Willoughby, and Captain Nesbitt Willoughby did indeed lead a cutting out raid at Jacote. I'm not sure that it was an American boat that he took, but anyway, he took a boat, the vessel that was going to eventually carry the first party ashore in the landings at Saint Denis, which we're coming to in this chapter. So Clonfert's been off performing, and Jack realizes all the risk that he's taken and the problems that he's left behind, right?
Yeah, that this was, a completely unnecessary raid, that the entire invasion plan would have been ruined if something had happened to the Nereid. And Jack pragmatically decides, all right, I got to keep Clonfert on a short leash. And he tells Stephen, we're going to take Clonfert with us to the staging island of Rodriguez to, as Jack says, keep his ardent spirits out of the way of temptation. It says, Jack adds that he may dash till he goes blue in the face once the real battle is engaged.
So, Mike, this is a really great example of the maturity of Jack Aubrey in the role of Commodore. He's managing the flaws of his subordinates, especially Clonfert, to serve a broader strategic goal. So he heads over to Rodriguez with the squadron. This island has been transformed into an even more massive military camp with thousands of redcoats and sepoys. And not only do we have redcoats and their plumage, all planning the invasion logistics, Stephen knows that there's the bones of an extinct bird on the island. And we get this passing reference to the solitaire. The solitaire, which, along with the dodo, was one of two species of bird that were genuinely made extinct at exactly this time by, human exploration and human hunting. But Stephen's fascinated with the solitaire. He goes trying to dig up the bones of the solitaire, and he hears a voice as he's doing this digging shouting, "Doctor, doctor." And he's really PO. He doesn't like people calling him out. He thinks it's going to be somebody else with some kind of ailment who wants his help. And he's turning around ready to really give them the brush off. But, Mike, who is it that's calling for the doctor?
Yeah, I love this because it's not McAdam saying, come take care of Clonfert. It's such a joyous moment for, I think, anybody who's a long-term reader for sure. And even if you're just up to the Mauritius command, you know who this is. There's this tall, lank, and still very boyish form, writes O'Brien, of Thomas Pullings. Pullings has been with Jack and with Stephen. I mean, when Stephen first walked on board with Jack, there's Pullings. So since the very first command of the Sophie. And we know how much Pullings has struggled. He was passed over for promotion repeatedly because he lacked political influence, wasn't considered enough of a gentleman by some admirals. But here he is beaming with pride because he finally has a command.
Right. And he pitches it to Stephen in this way. "I'm not a captain by land," he says, "but at sea you could call me captain," because he's in command of this transport called the Groper. He points out this ship to Stephen. Stephen, ever the polite friend, describes it as elegant, even though O'Brien says this is a squat, thick object that looks, even to Stephen's inexpert eye, like a Dutch herring bus, which is O'Brien's go-to description for a thick, ugly, squat, unprepossessing kind of ship. And the joy of this reunion, Mike, is really infectious. We've got Stephen and Pullings here. We've got this nice, cute little vignette with Pullings in his new command. Meanwhile, we've got the troops being embarked in a marvelous display of efficiency. There's a Crimson Major who boasts when they finally finished the embarkation that they did it in 1 minute 53 seconds a man, which beats a record held by the Duke of Wellington. I have no idea if that's a real thing or if it's Wellington's record, but the Major's clearly pretty proud. And duly, the fleet sails off for La Réunion, heading westwards towards the setting sun.
Yeah, the ships are gliding toward the beaches where the invasion is going to happen, and the gravity of the situation settles over all the characters. There's great descriptions of Keating's reaction and Jack's reaction, but I think one that really caught our eye was Stephen pacing the quarterdeck, and O'Brien gives us this dig into his core motivation. O'Brien writes that Stephen is silently hating Bonaparte and all the evil he has brought into the world.
And we mentioned this earlier on. O'Brien points us towards Stephen's hatred of and preoccupation with Bonaparte as a big part of his motivating factor here. I think I'm kind of with that. Stephen, we've known for a long time, is very highly motivated to do his part to unseat Napoleon. A vulgar man with ambition, intent on destroying France, which is a country and a culture that Stephen loves. He reflects on the infamous treatment of the Pope. Stephen is a Catholic, and thinks about what he might have done to Ireland if that invasion attempt back in the late 18th century had turned out. A police state, he thinks, run by informers. And
wow,
this isn't only his philosophical conviction, Mike. I mean, he really knows something about what he's talking about here.
He really does. He's a deadly intelligence agent driven by an absolute burning philosophical and political conviction. In earlier books, we've learned a little bit about Stephen's history, and this is not new. What drives him? He hates tyranny, and his internal monologue is so intense that the glare on his face is so fierce that a young soldier from the 86th catches what O'Brien describes as the pale, wicked glare full in the eye. and literally backs away from Stephen in shock. And we remember this in Post Captain, this glare that Stephen can have in his eye, and we'll hear it again in the canon. Boy, Stephen wears his feelings sometimes not like an intelligence agent, but right there on his sleeve, or shall we say in his eye here.
Absolutely. So we've had this nice little wrap up to this preparatory section of everybody getting together and us digging deep into Stephen's motivation. The stage is set now for this assault on La Réunion. And after all the logistical delays at the Cape, the bureaucratic wrangling, the invasion is finally underway. Remember, what we had a couple of chapters ago was a raid. This is actually going to be taking territory if we can pull it off. We've got this extended military force. We've got this fleet that has left Rodriguez and is now sailing towards the setting sun, with Aubrey and Keating focused on the logistics of moving what are now thousands of men. Jack and Keating have got this really complex plan. They're going to do a feint at a town called Sainte-Marie to draw the French forces out, while the actual landings are going to take place at two separate beaches, Grande Chaloupe and Rivière des Pluies. Those two being either side of the capital, which is Saint-Denis. I'm like, this is pretty much in line with the real story. Once again, Patrick O'Brien's very happy to tell the real story as it was, because it's just as exciting and just as dramatic as anything that he could have made up here. Now, last time we had a fairly peaceful landing and a fairly peaceful sort of action in the little harbor there. This time we're off a beach and the environment's playing out a bit differently.
Yeah, we've heard Jack. I mean, in the detail, Jack has now for at least a day been worried about the surf as perhaps a greater risk in this part of the Indian Ocean than the French, and he kept looking at the barometer, and everybody's going, "Oh, look, it looks good." And he's saying, yeah, but I wonder what it's going to look like 12 hours from now. I wonder what, and sure enough, all his fears are immediately realized as they reach this Rivière des Pluies, that Lord Clonfert insists the landing is practicable. He says, Jack calls him over. Do you know this deep water passage? Yes, I do. Can you do a landing? Absolutely, I can do it. So Nereids boats run in, led by a local schooner that Clonfert had obtained. And O'Brien's description of the surf is really terrifying. The schooner gets through the breakers, but it strikes 10 yards from shore. It gets caught in the backdraft, and the next massive wave breaks the back of this schooner entirely. The men, you've got this repeated thing of the boats, kind of getting dumped in these massive waves. The people mostly make it to shore, but the boats are beaten to pieces. And then they see at least 4 men have drowned and are floating back out here. So it's a scene that grabbed me. I tell you, right. I was not ready to go jump on the next transport here.
No. And it's funny. I think we're going to get more and more of the immediate kind of visceral reality of some of this campaign coming in more and more in this book. And again, Mike, this scene is exactly as described. The only thing in the real world is that, interestingly, the boat that was captured at Jacotet by Willoughby's cutting out expedition was the one that was used and was wrecked in exactly the way he's talked about here.
Wow.
So now Jack has this heartbreaking command decision. There's this whole squadron with all the transports and the soldiers all ready to go ashore. The troops must land to support the other wings of troops who've gone ashore. So he turns to the one resource that he has, which is Tom Pulling. With his pride and joy, his command, his first command, he says, "Tom, here's what I need you to do. I need you to anchor off and make a breakwater," which he does. He runs the groper inshore, puts out an anchor warp. The anchor warp parts, and the groper is smashed to pieces on the shore, just like the earlier vessel had been. It's brilliant execution by Pullings, and he does create the zone of quiet water, and it is just long enough to give space and calm water to get the First Division ashore. But it's a stark reminder of the physical cost and jeopardy of these amphibious assaults. And again, happened exactly as described in reality. The transport was called the Olney in the real campaign. I'm pretty sure the commander was not called Pullings.
Yeah.
But all of the exploits of Clonfert and the surf and the landings and the actions of the captains on the scene are all very, very close here in O'Brien's text to what we read about in the historical record as well. Now, what happens next and Clonfert's behavior with his forces ashore, this seems to be from O'Brien's characterization of Clonfert and not really connected to the character of Nesbitt Willoughby. And how's he getting along here, our man Clonfert, would you say?
Well, it's interesting. So you've got all these men who have made it onto the beach, including Lord Clonfert, and they're trapped there with most of their powder wet as the French columns advance on the road above them. And it gives us this kind of bizarre theatrical character moment for Clonfert.
Yeah.
They built this turf wall, and Clonfert stands up on top of this turf wall. Entirely conspicuous. He's got, again, this full dress uniform and his star, his sword and everything. He's eating a biscuit. And these troops, they've noticed that apparently a messenger has ridden out to these troops. The troops, clearly, the French troops are being called back. So the other landing must have succeeded and they must have called for help because they're calling them back. But these troops are kind of dropping down and firing a volley on the British here before they go. Everyone fires a volley or two. And Clonfert stands there in these volleys on top of the wall, eating a biscuit. And whenever they fire a volley, Clonfert puts down his biscuit, grabs a musket from a soldier, and fires back at him. And it says usually, his gun misfires once he hits an officer's horse. But he just stands up here, and resumes eating his biscuit, waiting for the next thing. So it's, I don't know, it's this incredibly brave thing, but also kind of ludicrous. He can't really do much, and it's utterly performative, like you've been saying, Ian.
Yeah. And it's funny, there are many pictures of Sir Sidney Smith, who is Clonfert's presumed hero and mentor. There are many pictures of Sir Sidney Smith at the Battle of Acre in the late 18th century that look like they are the visual inspiration for this now pen portrait that we've got of Clonfert standing full dress uniform, waving a sword, or minus the biscuit, of course. I'll see if I can get one of them out onto our social media channels as the episode comes out.
Excellent.
But again, like you say, Mike, this is there's no doubt that there's an element of bravery here. Like, he is careless of his own safety, but on the other hand, it's 100% you can see that he's doing it for the sake of demonstrating the courage rather than for actually getting the outcome of what he's looking for. He's playing the role of the dashing hero. He's disconnected from the tactical realities, and now the surf is too heavy. We can't get any more men ashore. Jack and Keating are forced to sail around the island to Grand Chaloupe on the leeward side, where the other half of the army under Colonel Fraser has landed safely. And as we turn this particular page, Mike, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how's it all going to go on here? Has Clonfert squandered an opportunity here, or are the other men in command of the other forces ashore going to behave differently?
Everything is different here, Ian. This is the leeward side. There's all gentle surf. Everybody's on shore. They've lined up. They've flanked the enemy. The contrast is just brilliant here. It's all going according to the 19th century military textbook here. Troops are formed in perfect squares. Sepoys are flanking. Sailors have dragged howitzers up the hills. Yeah. Colonel Keating rides up, and he immediately goes to shore and gets to ride up. So Keating's so frustrated, he didn't know what to do on the ship with his men ashore and can't get messages to him. What in the world? Well, here he is. He goes immediately ashore, gets a horse, rides up, and admires what he calls this charmingly regular attack and what he calls the most judicious defense of the French. So it's like somebody walking into, watch chess masters going against each other and just admiring both sets here. And they are treating this like a grand, deadly chessboard, practically drooling over the prospect of this massive set-piece battle.
And it's funny, isn't it? Lord Clonfert has been performing with vanity, and that results in him doing all these kind of crazy posturing and putting himself in danger. There's a little bit of vanity going on here with the soldiers because they are really relishing their chance to execute this beautifully performed and executed and staged set piece battle. It's going to be a real career highlight for them. Albeit, I think they've earned it. Like, they've planned and executed well, and when this set piece battle plays out, it looks like it's going to get them exactly what the mission needs, not only glory for themselves. You can see one or two connections between Clonfert's conduct and the military preening, if you like, of Keating and the other soldiers here. But vanity, preening, a well-wrought plan, execution on the brink of success. This is a moment for Patrick O'Brian to pull the rug out from under. And who does he recruit to do the rug pulling other than Stephen Maturin? Keating is wondering here why Fraser hasn't ordered the charge yet. There's a parley, says Fraser, a parley in train, meaning a parley in progress. There's a little truce negotiation going on. Stephen, it is, who walks up with the French commander, Colonel Saint-Suzanne, and some local civilian administrators. He's under a flag of truce. All of his prior work, all of his work with ink, both black ink and secret ink, all of his work with gold, presumably maybe even with the odd counterfeit banknote, who knows, all of this work, subverting the local militia, exploiting religious and political fault lines, have completely eroded the French will to fight. And the British colonels are furious when Stephen tells them that the French wish to capitulate to, in his words, avert the effusion of human blood. Honestly, Mike, some people, eh?
Yeah. Well, and I would say that I think the one thing that's different between Clonfert and the military guys, even though they love their setup here, is they realize that, this is not going to be, we're going to fire some volleys and it's all over. They realize this is going to be weeks of ground gained, a yard at a time, at hundreds and hundreds of people dead on both sides and everything. But they're like, we're in a good chance. We could win this. It's going to take all this, but they're willing to give it. But here, Stephen is like cheated them out of it. And Keating gives Stephen this icy glare. And Jack, who's stuck on the ship eating a snack and wondering why all the guns have stopped, gets this hastily scribbled note from Keating that perfectly encapsulates, I think, the military mindset of that era.
Right. Here's Keating's note. It says, "Your friend has disappointed us. He has done us out of a battle, as neat a battle as you could wish to see." So, no, thank you for avoiding all the bloodshed. No, thank you for making what this is, which is a rare, successful, and bloodless amphibious operation. Amphibious operations have always been, casualties from time immemorial. No. He's taken the wind out of the soldiers' sails, and they are not happy. But it is a brilliant anticlimax, right? The action has played out quite differently to what we had back in chapter 4. That was a violent action, the raid on St. Paul's. There was some hand-to-hand combat. We had batteries blown up. We had people captured. But this time, the invasion is won not by round shot and cutlasses, but by the quiet, intellectual, and bloodless work of an intelligence agent and a political advisor, which is what Stephen Maturin is.
It's interesting, Ian, because I think, I remember some of the reviews that came out originally with the Mauritius Command, most of which were wonderful. Yeah. But I think some reviewers that had an issue with it said there was a lot of anticlimactic things going on here. And I thought, here's the difference. This is the difference between naval fiction written by Patrick O'Brian that says this is what actually happens, and naval fiction written by, let's tell heroes' stories. Right. And let's not get into the depth underneath of Clonfert or Keating necessarily. So I love that. Well, this is Stephen's ideological hatred of tyranny, which we saw at the start of this voyage, culminates in saving hundreds of lives on both sides. And La Réunion falls with barely a shot fired from the main army. So, wow. Ian, how close to this, though, was this outcome in the Patrick O'Brian telling of the story, and what happened in real life?
It's a great question, because if you're one of those armchair critics who says, why did you whip out the rug from this great climactic battle? This is more or less what happened. The real life invasion also ended with a truce. The French failed to put up a meaningful resistance. There wasn't, as far as anybody knows, a Stephen Maturin type person pulling the political strings. The action wasn't completely bloodless. There were 22 dead and 79 wounded on the British side, which for an amphibious operation of this size is a really light butcher's bill. And that was how it went. And from this point, La Réunion was in British hands. There was a real-life Governor Farquhar who became governor of La Réunion at that point. And what happens in the rest of the campaign, we'll talk about as the chapters of the book unfold. But this was a big success. And all of the preparation brought it to the point where it was. You wouldn't have undertaken it without all the preparation of the soldiers and the amphibious landings and all the rest of it. But the French were presented with what the French like to call a fait accompli. It was all done and they had nowhere to go. So they surrendered, and that's how it worked out. And Mike, there's been a few themes in this chapter, and although it ends bloodlessly, this has been a chapter about, you might say, life and death, right?
Well, it has the value of human life, and the fact that it ends bloodlessly was kind of coming down. It sounds like a little bit more heavily on one side of that equation than the other. And, we just started to pick at who are the true heroes here, but we've had this thing about capital punishment, about death in battle, maybe even, whisper, the potential for the arrival of new human life, but that's a subtext. But we do have Stephen's porcupine fetus, and all of this woven throughout.
And all the illegitimate children in Cape Town.
Well, exactly. Human life, and how are we valuing them, right? Yes. And, we also have this contrast between Clonford's view and his behavior. Let me just take pot shots at these guys as they're headed out. Wait, these human lives that you're so precious, they volleyed, they're leaving and you're shooting at them. But, and this thing between actual actions and performative valor and everything, we get Clonford versus more, if you will, adult, sometimes you might say more human characters like Aubrey and Maturin and Keating. But as O'Brien would always remind us, Clonford's human too, hence his inclusion, because this is the human condition. And as the judges on the court-martial say, there might also go I in any and all of these characters, and they are not black and white. They are gray and mixture. So I don't know. What do you think, Ian, for next time?
I think hopefully we're going to see more of this campaign. I have a feeling that we're going to see the campaign moving on to the hoped for capture of the more heavily fortified island of Mauritius. Maybe that has the potential to be maybe not so bloodless. We have to wonder as well whether Stephen's luck and Jack's luck are going to continue in the ascendant, or whether there's going to be something coming along to challenge that. What role is Clonford going to play in all of this? But Mike, before we get into the next chapter, I just want to mention to the listeners that we're excited to bring you next time, barring disasters, our first special guest interview of the current era of the Lubber's Hole. That's right. We, just like Taylor Swift, have taken on eras. We've got a special guest hopefully coming next time round. Our guest is a nationally recognized reviewer of historical fiction, a lifelong Patrick O'Brian fan, and we've already had some of the initial conversations. This is going to be great fun. You're going to love it. We're not going to give a name just yet because, many a slip. But if all works out, you're going to have a great special guest interview next time. Watch our social media channels over the next few days for details. Meanwhile, if you're a Patreon supporter, check your email, because we've invited you to help us out with questions to pitch to our special guest. So that's what we have in store for next time.
That sounds great. Well, Ian, the time after that, what do you say to just a little bit more Patrick O'Brian?
With all my heart.